Welcome back to our channel. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Tonight's Hopetales story begins with a routine Boeing 787 Dreamliner flight, one that would soon turn into a nighttime battle for survival. The Boeing 787 pushed back from the gate shortly after sunset, its windows glowing softly against the darkening airport. Passengers settled into their seats, unaware that the night ahead would test every ounce of strength, precision, and hope aboard the aircraft. The Dreamliner, known for its quiet engines and smooth ride, climbed steadily into the sky, leaving the lights of the city far below. The cabin dimmed to a warm blue, and the world outside faded into the deep black of night. At 35,000 feet, everything seemed normal. The engines hummed with the reliable consistency that made the 787 famous. The crew moved calmly through the aisles, performing their routine checks. In the cockpit, the pilots monitored the navigation screens glowing green and amber, guiding them across hundreds of miles of open night sky. The passengers relaxed, some watching movies, others drifting into sleep, wrapped in the comfort of a peaceful long-haul journey. But nature rarely announces its intentions. High above the clouds, the atmosphere shifted. Winds began to swirl. A thin layer of turbulence shook the aircraft gently at first, enough for a few passengers to glance nervously at the overhead bins. The Dreamliner's wings flexed smoothly, built to withstand far more than this minor disturbance. And the pilots noted the turbulence on their instruments as the aircraft continued its course. Minutes passed. The shaking grew stronger, more insistent. The flight attendants paused their service, securing loose items as the vibrations intensified. Outside, the sky remained completely black. No moonlight, no horizon. Just the endless void that made it impossible to judge distance or shape. The Boeing 787 cut through the darkness, its presence small against the vast and invisible sky. Then, unexpectedly, the calm systems of the cockpit began to flash warnings. A faint alert sounded. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, changed in the engine's performance data. It wasn't dramatic, not yet, but it was unusual. A slight imbalance appeared between the two massive turbofan engines, the kind of detail that only precise instruments could detect. The pilots leaned forward, watching the numbers carefully. Below the aircraft, weather radar detected something else, a massive storm system building rapidly ahead. What appeared earlier as scattered turbulence now revealed itself as a sprawling wall of clouds, stretching upward like a mountain of lightning and wind. This wasn't a storm to pass over. It wasn't one to glide under. It was the kind of system pilots avoided at all costs, but it was directly in their path. The aircraft descended slightly to avoid the worst of the turbulence. The wings rocked. Passengers gripped armrests. The lights in the cabin flickered as the Dreamliner entered the outer edge of the storm. Rain began to lash against the fuselage, invisible in the dark but loud enough to be heard as a constant drumming. Sudden downdraft pushed the plane downward, jolting the passengers and sending items sliding forward. The Dreamliner recovered quickly, stabilizing as the autopilot compensated, but the sensation left the cabin tense and silent. Everyone felt it. Something was changing. Something was wrong. In the cockpit, the situation grew more complicated. The imbalance in the engines had increased. One engine was not failing, but it was behaving unpredictably, spiking and dropping in thrust. The pilots monitored it closely, making small adjustments to keep the aircraft stable. The Boeing 787's advanced systems were designed to handle emergencies, but no system could remove the unpredictability of flying into a severe nighttime storm. Lightning lit up the sky, briefly illuminating the wings and engine nacelles in harsh white flashes. The aircraft shook again, harder than before. The cabin lights flickered for a second time, drawing a few startled gasps from passengers. Overhead bins rattled. The sound of the engines fluctuated as the Dreamliner fought the violent air currents. The storm thickened around the aircraft. Radar icons danced across the cockpit screen, towering cumulonimbus clouds, wind shear warnings, turbulence zones. Every direction ahead showed danger. Every alternative path looked worse than the next. Still, the crew remained calm, working through procedures, relying on training shaped by decades of aviation knowledge. The Boeing 787 continued forward, its composite wings flexing and twisting through the storm's chaos. Then came the moment no passenger forgets. A shudder ran through the plane, not like turbulence, But like a heavy slam from beneath, a strong upward jolt followed, forcing passengers back into their seats. The aircraft lost altitude for a few seconds, then rapidly corrected. Loose items scattered across the aisle. A sense of fear swept through the cabin like a wave. Outside, lightning crackled dangerously close. The aircraft's sensors detected another violent burst of wind shear. The pilots reacted instantly, pulling the Boeing 787 out of a sudden downward drop. The engines roared, pushing against the invisible force trying to pull the aircraft toward the storm's core. Then the cockpit instruments changed again, this time unmistakably. The troubled engine's performance dropped sharply. Not total failure, but partial power loss. The kind of malfunction that could escalate in seconds. The Dreamliner could fly with one engine, but not comfortably in a storm of this magnitude. Not at night. Not with unpredictable winds and no safe altitude. The decision became clear. The aircraft could not continue on its planned route. A diversion was necessary and urgent, but the nearest airport was over 200 miles away, surrounded by rough terrain and reachable only by navigating through one final section of the storm. It wouldn't be easy. It would require precision coordination, steady hands, and courage under enormous pressure. The cabin lights dimmed further as the Boeing 787 turned, leaving its original flight path. The storm outside grew louder, angrier. Deep inside the night sky, the Dreamliner began its fight for survival, carrying hundreds of souls toward an uncertain destination. And the crew knew one thing: this emergency landing would have to happen tonight. The Boeing 787 began its diversion turn, the aircraft banking slowly through the thick, violent darkness of the night storm. Welcome back to our channel. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe as this tense nighttime emergency continues to unfold. As the Dreamliner shifted course, the wings flexed sharply against the turbulent blasts ripping through the sky. The passengers felt the change immediately. The descent, the angle of the turn, the sudden shift in weight, all of it sent a silent message through the cabin. Something more serious was happening. But the cabin crew maintained their composure, securing loose items and guiding passengers through the turbulence with steady gestures and calm presence. In the cockpit, the situation grew more complex by the second. The malfunctioning engine had not improved. Instead, the performance fluctuations became more frequent, dropping in thrust before kicking back up unpredictably. The second engine had to compensate, working harder than designed while still battling the storm. The pilots adjusted power settings carefully, trying to balance thrust and stability without putting too much strain on the functioning engine. Outside, the storm intensified. What had been scattered turbulence earlier now became a chaotic combination of wind shear, vertical drafts, and electric activity. Lightning flashed across the cockpit windows, each burst briefly illuminating the outlines of the storm clouds, towering structures. Stretching miles upward, their shapes churning and twisting in the darkness. Rain hammered the fuselage with a force that echoed throughout the cabin. The Dreamliner continued descending toward a safer altitude, but the storm did not tolerate weakness. Every downward movement felt like a battle against unseen currents. A sudden gust threw the aircraft sideways, causing the wings to tilt dramatically before the pilots corrected the angle. Passengers gasped as drink cups and small items slid across their trays. Overhead lights flickered again, a subtle reminder of the electrical chaos outside. Then the aircraft shook, violently, one massive jolt, followed by a rapid series of smaller tremors that rattled the ceiling panels. The Dreamliner had entered the storm's core. Inside the cockpit, the pilots tightened their focus. Radar screens showed dense, dangerous formations of moisture and turbulence. Red patches dominated the display, indicating the worst possible weather. Green and yellow zones were minimal, offering no safe passage. The only path toward the diversion airport cut directly through the darkest sections of the storm. The partially failing engine surged again, briefly returning to normal thrust, then sagging. Temperature readings fluctuated. Pressure levels shifted. The pilots manually reduced power to avoid overheating, hoping to keep the engine alive long enough to reach the runway. Meanwhile, the passengers endured the storm's merciless force. The cabin swayed violently as crosswinds slammed against the Dreamliner. Some passengers held hands, others pressed their heads back against the seats, trying to stay calm through the chaos. Flight attendants moved with practiced expertise, bracing themselves against seatbacks while scanning for passengers who might need assistance. The aircraft altitude continued to drop in controlled increments. The crew aimed to get below the worst of the turbulence, but descending too low risked flying into mountains and rough terrain surrounding the nearest airport. It was a delicate balance, too high, and the storm punished the aircraft mercilessly. Too low, and the terrain became a threat. The storm's wind shear became more aggressive. Sudden drops in air pressure sent the Dreamliner sinking for a moment, before the engines struggled to stabilize lift. The wings shook, the entire fuselage shuddering as though caught in the grip of a massive invisible hand. Lightning struck again, this time so close that the flash blinded the cockpit for a second. A loud crack vibrated through the fuselage. The aircraft absorbed the strike as designed, channeling the electricity safely, but the impact rattled everyone on board. The cockpit instruments flickered but quickly returned to normal. Despite the pounding weather, the crew pressed forward with the diversion, calculating every mile, every altitude shift, every engine fluctuation. But the storm was not done. Out of nowhere, a tremendous updraft hit the aircraft, lifting it sharply upward. The sudden rise sent passengers back into their seats as the Dreamliner's altitude spiked. Immediately afterward, a downward microburst forced the jet into a rapid descent. Alarms briefly chimed inside the cockpit as the pilots fought for control. The disturbance lasted only seconds, but it felt like minutes. In those moments, fear swept through the cabin, carried silently in widened eyes and white knuckles gripping armrests. Outside the windows, the lightning storms glowed eerily, revealing the swirling chaos around the aircraft. Sheets of rain streamed upward across the glass as the Dreamliner moved through, shifting air currents. The sound of the engines strained against the storm, their roar rising and falling with every adjustment. The malfunctioning engine weakened again, losing additional thrust. Its power dropped to a level that forced the pilots to compensate quickly. The functioning engine took on even more strain, pushing to maintain altitude and airspeed while avoiding overstress. Inside the cabin, the vibrations grew stronger, resonating through the seats and floor. A few overhead bins popped open from the violent shaking, spilling soft items onto the aisle. The crew rushed to secure them, bracing themselves as the aircraft lurched again. The cockpit decision became inevitable. The Dreamliner had to begin its initial approach soon, storm or no storm. The diversion airport lay just ahead, but only barely visible on the instruments through the storm's interference. The aircraft needed to lose altitude, but controlled descent in such turbulence demanded precision and timing. The pilots initiated a gradual descent, adjusting the aircraft's nose downward. The Dreamliner responded, though shakily. Wind shear continued to strike from all sides, pushing and pulling the jet unpredictably. The storm became a twisting maze of forces, and the Dreamliner struggled to stay on its correct flight path. As the aircraft emerged from the highest altitude turbulence, the storm below proved no kinder. Heavy rainfall and updrafts continued to batter the Dreamliner. The lights of the diversion airport remained hidden beneath layers of cloud. The flight crew prepared the cabin for landing. Passengers watched anxiously as the aircraft descended into the darker, heavier layers of the storm. And as the Dreamliner dropped below the final cloud barrier, the faint glow of city lights finally appeared, small, blurred, and uncertain. The runway was still miles away. The storm still raged. The engine still struggled, but hope flickered beneath the clouds. The emergency landing was about to begin. The storm showed no mercy as the Boeing 787 leveled its descent toward the diversion airport. Welcome back to Hopetales. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe as we continue this gripping nighttime aviation emergency. Every second now mattered. Every adjustment could determine the difference between a safe landing and disaster. The pilots had assessed the situation carefully. The malfunctioning engine continued to fluctuate in power output, forcing them to rely heavily on the functioning engine. The autopilot had been disengaged. The aircraft flying entirely under manual control. Instruments glowed softly in the cockpit, warning lights flickering occasionally, as the system strained against the storm's chaos. Outside, the storm's fury had not diminished. Rain pelted the fuselage with relentless force, and sheets of lightning flashed across the clouds. Wind shear struck the plane unpredictably, pushing the Dreamliner into sharp rolls and sudden drops. Each gust required immediate correction, every throttle adjustment calculated with precision. The aircraft's composite wings flexed under pressure, absorbing forces far beyond what most passengers would ever imagine. Inside the cabin, tension had reached its peak. Passengers gripped armrests, knuckles white. Overhead bins rattled violently as the plane pitched and rolled. Flight attendants braced against seats, maintaining calm while scanning the aisles for anyone in distress. Some passengers whispered prayers. Others clutched each other silently. Fear filled the confined space. Yet the professionalism of the crew kept panic at bay. The first visual signs of the diversion airport finally appeared through the storm's shroud, a faint glow of runway lights, dimly visible through the sheets of rain. It was a narrow window, but it was enough. The pilots focused all attention, aligning the aircraft carefully for the approach. Any miscalculation could lead to overshooting the runway or an unsafe landing. The Dreamliner continued its descent, buffeted by turbulence that refused to relent. A sudden downdraft pushed the aircraft downward. Alarms briefly chimed inside the cockpit as altitude fluctuated sharply. The pilots responded instantly, pulling back on the yoke while adjusting throttle to maintain balance. The plane leveled again, trembling as it fought the storm's relentless force. The malfunctioning engine provided inconsistent thrust, sometimes surging, sometimes lagging. The pilots compensated by making small but precise adjustments to the functioning engine. Each correction required constant attention, requiring both skill and nerves of steel. The 787 systems were advanced, but the storm and the failing engine created a scenario that no automated system could fully resolve. Meanwhile, the visibility remained extremely low. Rain streaked across the windows, and the darkness of night made it almost impossible to distinguish the runway from surrounding terrain. The pilots relied heavily on instruments and runway guidance systems to ensure proper alignment. Even a slight deviation could be catastrophic. Inside the cabin, passengers could sense the urgency. Each shift in the aircraft's motion caused murmurs, gasps, and moments of frozen silence. The cabin crew moved swiftly, ensuring seatbelts were fastened and passengers remained as safe as possible. Every hand, every gesture, every calm instruction was vital in preventing panic from spreading. The aircraft entered the final approach path. The pilots reduced speed carefully, adjusting flaps and landing gear while maintaining altitude in the turbulent air. Outside, the runway lights became more defined, cutting through the storm like beacons of hope. But the storm still pushed against the aircraft from all sides. Wind gusts threatened to veer the plane off course. Rain and wind blurred perception, leaving nothing to chance. The Dreamliner's wings flexed under enormous aerodynamic pressure. Every control input was matched with a counter input to maintain stability. The pilot's training and experience became the only shields against the storm's chaotic energy. Each second felt like an eternity as the aircraft drew closer to the runway, shaking violently with every gust and turbulent strike. Passengers braced as the aircraft continued its descent. The plane pitched and rolled subtly with each turbulence encounter. Drinks sloshed in cups and small objects rattled. Yet the professionalism of the crew reassured them silently that everything possible was being done. There was no panic, only hope, fear, and reliance on the pilot's skill. The runway lights grew larger, more distinct. The pilots made final adjustments to line up with the touchdown zone. The landing gear was fully deployed, flaps at the correct angle, throttles finely tuned. The storm had not relented, but a path through the turbulence had been found. Suddenly, a particularly violent gust struck, pushing the aircraft slightly off-center. The pilots reacted instantly, applying rudder and aileron corrections, while adjusting throttle to compensate. For the failing engine, the Dreamliner leveled, shaking but aligned. The storm had thrown everything it could, but the aircraft responded to human skill and precise inputs. The final moments were tense. The aircraft descended toward the runway, the wheels approaching the tarmac. Rain streaked across the fuselage as the plane touched down, rebounding slightly with the force of the uneven surface but quickly stabilizing. The 787's advanced landing gear absorbed the impact, holding the aircraft securely on the slick runway. Emergency lights glowed along the sides as braking systems engaged fully. Passengers exhaled collectively, the tension in the cabin breaking as reality sank in. They were safe. The crew worked efficiently to slow the aircraft, bringing it to a complete stop. Outside, emergency crews remained on alert, prepared for the worst. But their services were ultimately not needed beyond the precautionary measures. Inside, passengers began to process what had just occurred. Fear transformed into relief, whispers into sighs of gratitude. Flight attendants moved efficiently, reassuring passengers and preparing them for disembarkation. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, there was calm, safety, and a sense of accomplishment. The pilots, still in the cockpit, allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. They had navigated one of the most difficult nighttime landings in their careers. The aircraft, despite a malfunctioning engine and the storm's fury, had responded to skill, training, and focus. Every life on board had been preserved. The Boeing 787, a marvel of engineering, had been pushed to its limits. But through coordination, precision, and determination, the passengers and crew had survived a night that could have ended tragically. And as the aircraft came to a complete stop on the wet tarmac, under the glow of storm lights and emergency vehicles, one thing was clear. In the darkest of nights, with the storm howling outside, courage, skill, and hope had guided everyone safely home. The Boeing 787 finally aligned with the runway. Welcome back to Hopetales. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe as we witness the gripping conclusion of this nighttime aviation emergency. After a turbulent approach through violent weather, the Dreamliner's wheels hovered above the wet tarmac, rain streaking across fuselage and windows. Outside, emergency vehicles lined the runway, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. The storm had not yet fully released its fury, but the aircraft had reached the final stage, landing. Inside the cockpit, the pilots remained focused. One hand on the yoke, the other adjusting throttles, they coordinated each control surface meticulously. The malfunctioning engine demanded constant attention, fluctuating unpredictably even in the final seconds before touchdown. Every micro-adjustment mattered. Any delay, any hesitation could result in a veer off the runway or a hard landing. The storm's gusts continued to buffet the aircraft. Rain pounded the fuselage with the intensity of a waterfall, the sound reverberating throughout the cabin. Lightning illuminated the wings and engines in harsh bursts, creating a strobing effect that added to the tension. Yet the Dreamliner's composite structure flexed and absorbed the energy with remarkable precision. Passengers gripped their armrests as the aircraft lowered onto the runway. A few whispered prayers. Others held tightly to the hands of their neighbors. Flight attendants braced themselves, ensuring every passenger remained secure. The cabin vibrated with the forces of the landing, rattling bins and loose items. Yet no panic erupted. The calm professionalism of the crew kept the atmosphere tense but controlled. The first wheels made contact. A subtle jolt ran through the fuselage, but the landing gear absorbed it gracefully. The aircraft bounced lightly once, then stabilized. Pilots modulated brakes and reverse thrusters with precision, countering the slick runway's reduced friction due to heavy rainfall. Every movement was measured, exact, controlled. Outside, the emergency vehicles followed cautiously, lights reflecting off the wet tarmac. Their crews stood ready. But the pilot's skill was evident. The aircraft was responding. Despite the storm, despite the malfunctioning engine, despite the near-impossible conditions, the Boeing 787 was on the runway, intact and under control. The plane decelerated gradually, controlled by a combination of reverse thrust and braking systems. Steam rose from the wheels as friction met the rain-soaked asphalt. The aircraft's fuselage glimmered in, reflections of emergency lights and storm flashes. Inside, passengers began to relax incrementally, sensing that survival was within reach. Finally, after what felt like hours compressed into tense minutes, the Dreamliner came to a full stop. Engines idled, reverse thrust disengaged, and the pilots allowed themselves a brief exhale. The aircraft sat poised and steady. The storm continued around the airport, but the immediate danger had passed. The night, once terrifying, had become a testament to endurance, skill, and hope. Passengers began to exhale fully. Faces that had been tense and anxious softened with relief. Tears glistened in eyes, some shed silently, others in small whispers of gratitude. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, calmly instructing everyone to remain seated until conditions were verified as safe. The tension inside transformed into quiet celebration, hearts beating fast, yet grateful. The pilots remained in the cockpit for a moment longer, verifying engine performance and system stability. The malfunctioning engine had stabilized enough to shut down safely, its unpredictable surges finally contained. Communications with airport control confirmed the aircraft's stable status and safe position on the runway. Every step of the process, every measurement, every cautious adjustment had led to this successful conclusion. Outside the plane, emergency crews approached for standard precaution checks. Fire trucks and ambulances stood ready, but no immediate action was needed. The storm still raged in the distance. But here on the runway, humanity had prevailed. Skill, training, and calm execution had turned a potentially catastrophic situation into survival. Passengers began to disembark in small groups once cleared. The rain had lessened, but the storm's presence was still palpable. Crew members guided everyone safely, assisting the elderly and children first. Outside, airport staff checked the aircraft thoroughly, ensuring all systems were secure and the engines safe. The Boeing 787 gleamed under the rain and emergency lights, a testament to engineering excellence and human endurance. In quiet corners of the tarmac, passengers reflected on the ordeal. Some whispered thanks to the pilots. Some silently thanked fate. Others simply sat in stunned relief, processing that what had seemed impossible, surviving a night storm with a malfunctioning engine, was now reality. Each individual had survived thanks to the skill of the pilots, the professionalism of the crew, and the resilience of the Dreamliner itself. The aircraft's storm-stricken wings flexed gently as the storm began to pass. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the sky but no longer threatening the runway. The Dreamliner had weathered the storm, had endured its worst, and had delivered hundreds of souls safely to solid ground. For the pilots, the crew, and the passengers, the night became a story to remember, one of courage, calm under pressure, and the extraordinary capacity of humans and machines to survive against overwhelming odds. The Boeing 787 had proven not only the strength of its design but also the precision, skill, and unwavering determination of the people guiding it. As the last passengers left the aircraft and the emergency crews verified systems one final time, a calm settled over the airport. The storm's fury was fading, replaced by the quiet glow of city lights reflecting off wet runways. A night that had begun with fear and uncertainty ended in relief, safety, and quiet awe. The Boeing 787 rested on the tarmac, engines humming softly, storm clouds drifting away. The pilots exhaled, knowing that what had been faced was more than just a technical malfunction. It had been a trial of nerve, coordination, and hope, and they had succeeded. Above, the clouds parted slightly, revealing stars twinkling against the night sky. The Dreamliner, a modern marvel, had carried its passengers through danger to safety. And in that quiet moment, it was clear courage, preparation, and resilience had triumphed. The storm may have raged, but humanity had won the night.